Flowers and fruits are some of the most charismatic features of the angiosperms. That's the big group of plants that, simply put, bear their seeds in ovary tissues and that supply their growing embryos with a nutritious tissue called endosperm. Angiosperms, which include herbaceous plants, grasses, and most trees and shrubs, make up the majority of plants on Earth, with more than 250,000 species worldwide and nearly 2,900 species, 80% of all plant species, in New England. Flowers are really useful for distinguishing among plants in order to identify them. So let's take a closer look at the features of flowers to notice. First off, it's good to know that some flowers are seriously tiny, so you might want to have your hand lens handy in order to see them up close. Some flowers are practically microscopic, so if you find yourself becoming a nerd for, say, grasses or sedges, you might want to invest in a home microscope. But if you want to start a little easier, focus in on the bigger flowers. Look at the overall arrangement of the flower. Many flowers are what we call radially symmetrical. That is, their petals, sepals, or other parts are arrayed like spokes on a wheel. Other flowers take the shape of something like a human face. That is, they're bilaterally symmetrical. If I were to draw a vertical line from the top of my forehead to my chin, I'd see on each side an eye, half a nose, and half a smile. But if I draw a horizontal line across my nose, the upper and lower halves of my face would be completely different. It's the same with a flower, such as this lobelia. There's only one way to draw a line down the center of the flower, whereby the two halves mirror each other. If I draw a line across the flower, the upper and lower halves are really different. The next thing to notice about your flower is the color of its prominent parts. Petals or sepals are the most obvious things to look at. This fully open apple flower has whitish pink petals. But note that its buds are bright pink. Flowers can change colors as they age, and they can vary among plants themselves, so you want to look at a range of flowers across a plant or a population to note the variation in colors. Next, you'll want to count how many parts a flower has. Let's focus first on those big, showy petals of our apple flower. There are 5 of them. If we home in on the center of the flower, we find a cluster of its reproductive parts, including its anthers. The anthers are the yellowish structures that bear the pollen grains that will fertilize the egg. It may be a little hard to see here, but there are 10 anthers in this flower. If we take a close look at the so-called female reproductive structures, we see a cluster of round, greenish stigmas poised at the top of long, green styles. The stigmas are the receptive parts that will receive pollen grains once they're released. As this diagram of the flower shows, the pollen grain traveling from the anther to the stigma, and usually these are on different flowers or even different plants, it will germinate and send a long pollen tube down the style, which will then fertilize the egg to form a new plant embryo. Now, some flowers are highly specialized, such as orchids. Orchids are truly fantastical. Several of our New England species, such as lady slippers, have very colorful flowers that attract special insects to pollinate them. We'll talk about cool pollination strategies in a later video. Let's turn this yellow lady slipper to the side so that you can see the different parts. There are big sepals, one that overarches the lip and one tucked in back. You can tell they're sepals and not petals because they're the lowermost whorl, closest to where the flower meets its stem. Next up in the stack, out in front of the sepals, are the petals, which stick out to either side. And here's the swollen bucket-like lip. And here's the column, the business end of the orchid that contains the pollen-bearing anthers at the top and the stigmatic surface below, all fused into a single structure. Another very common but unusual flower is the aster, or daisy, in this case, New England aster. Since the aster family, or the Asteraceae, is one of the 2 most diverse species-rich families in the world, along with orchids, if you can become familiar with these species, you'll get to know a lot of New England plants pretty handily. Now, aster flowers aren't really flowers at all. Instead, they're actually groups or heads, usually of two very different kinds of flower, or floret. They're also known as composites. The first kind is the ray floret. On a typical daisy, these are the long, skinny structures you are pulling out when you play the wistful game, he loves me not. But gently pull off one of these florets, and you'll see that it actually has all the functional organs of a true flower, including a stigma and stamen. At the center of a typical aster head, you'll find a cluster of tiny disc florets. If you were to pull one out, here's what a disc floret might look like up close. On this one, you see a whorl of fused petals with the anthers just peeking up out of the center of the floret. The ovary is tucked down at the base of the floret, not actually shown in this drawing. But just above the ovary, which will develop into a single fruit, is a ring of appendages that may be thread-like or hair-like or, as in this case, kind of barbed. These are called the pappuses, and they're the means by which the mature seed will eventually get spread around. Just think of a dandelion. These white fuzzy pappuses will catch the wind or your breath, lofting the little fruit into the air. Other types of pappuses can stick to your clothes or animal fur like Velcro, another way in which they can hitchhike to a new home. Clever, huh? Note that some species in this family only have ray flowers, and others have only disc flowers, and some have both. They're all conspiring to confuse you. One other thing before we leave the amazing asters. Turn the flower head upside down and look at the overlapping rows of leaf-like bracts that form the base of the head, the barrel-like structure called an involucre. These bracts can take on amazing forms and are hugely useful for identifying different aster species. There are, of course, lots of other features you'll notice about flowers, and if you develop a fascination with them, you can figure out whether the plants each bear single flowers or groups of flowers, flowers of different sexes, the types of fruits that they produce, and you can develop an eye even for the tiny flowers of grasses, sedges, and rushes. But for now, just enjoy.